Hey everyone, welcome to Political Radar Echo, 30 minutes of political talk about current topics with panelists from a variety of viewpoints. I'm your host, Cassandra, and this is episode number 2.
This is Political Radar Echo with Cassandra, where we cover many political issues affecting our country with a panel of guests from many viewpoints.
Our panelists today are Lindsay, Dorff, and Vanya, Koepke. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
If you could introduce yourself a little bit, tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So I have kind of like a diverse work experience. I'd worked in publishing, and then I went back to school and got my Master of Arts in Education at Alverno College in Milwaukee and taught in the Green Bay public schools for about 4 years, if you include my student teaching and subbing experience. After that, I was staying home with my boys, so I was a small business owner, and now I'm very active in Citizen Action Northeast Wisconsin. I'm on their steering committee and working with their Fair Maps campaign.
Awesome. All right. And Vanya?
Yes, and I've been in Green Bay for about 4 years. Originally was adopted from Tom's Crusha when I was 10. Grew up in West Bend for about 10 years. Was homeschooled 5th grade through senior year of high school. Then got my associates at UW Washington County. And then transferred to UW Green Bay for my bachelor's in public administration and political science. Fell in love with the Green Bay community, turned down a few job offers at the Capitol in Madison, and just really excited to be here in Green Bay. I'm involved with the UW Green Bay Alumni Association, the Howe Community Resource Center, which your family is very much involved with, serve on their board, and the Current Young Professionals. I serve as the chair of their ambassador committee and spend my time working for Schneider National.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we're going to start tackling a big topic today. I know we can't solve this in 30 minutes, but we're going to start talking about education. And that is one of my passions. Just a little background for our listeners and viewers. I also have a background in education. I have taught with a full-time classroom 5th grade many years ago, and then I have subbed, and now we are actually a homeschool family. I homeschool my daughters. So I want to talk a little bit about choice and vouchers and all of that. So we talked a little bit before about it. If you want to get started.
Yeah, I'd actually like Vanya to start, if that's okay,
Sure,
in terms
sure.
of like sharing some of your background. 'Cause
Yeah.
I feel like I already understand my own position so well, and it will help me have more context if you start out.
Yeah, go ahead, Vanya.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have a phenomenal school system here in Green Bay. I think our educators are really committed to making the kids identifying who they are, learning more about them. And when it comes to families and choosing where they want their kids to find that identity, to learn and who they are ultimately, that's a perfect opportunity for the families to decide, well, should that be the Green Bay school system, or should it be a Schwabenon? Do we do a voucher, or do we homeschool our kids? So in general, I think there should be that flexibility and that freedom ultimately for families to choose how their kids are educated.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Something that has come up since we started homeschooling is, do you think that homeschool families should get voucher money to homeschool? What's your thoughts?
That's a really good point. We often talk about where does taxpayer money go into public and the private and the voucher system, but you see all the homeschool families who are paying the same taxes, or being taxed on the same amounts that kids who are in public school. And my parents didn't complain too much about it, and I still don't complain too much about it. But that's a really interesting point. Do we talk about, hey, if we're going to truly have that equal system where if vouchers are going to offset public education or private education, do we maybe invest into vouchers or tax breaks for homeschool families? I don't think that's a necessity. I don't think we're there yet, but it's definitely something worth exploring.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because it does come up a little bit in Trump's proposed education budget. So I just wanted to get your ideas on that. I also feel I would not want money to homeschool. I actually like that we don't get any federal funding or anything because it gives us the freedom to really do what we want.
That's
the
big
minute you
thing.
start taking money from the government is the minute they can start telling you a little more about what you should be doing. So,
With strings attached, right?
exactly.
For sure. Yeah,
right.
thanks for that.
Yeah. Lindsay.
So I guess like the first thing I wanted to respond to is I think this idea of choice comes up connected to vouchers very often. And to me, like people do have choices already. That's not really the question. People have the choice to go to a private school. They have the choice to homeschool. And I support, even though I'm like a very strong advocate of public schools, I support all of those choices. I mean, it's America. We should have choices about how we do these things. I think that's glossing over that the real fundamental issue is whether we should be taking money away from public education to fund these other options. So I don't know of any public school teacher who's like, no, nobody should be allowed to homeschool their children. Nobody should be allowed to choice. Like nobody should be allowed to go to private schools. Like that's not the conversation at all. And I feel like sometimes when it comes out framed as this issue of, well, we should have choices. Like those choices are there and nobody is arguing with those choices. It's just a lot of those choices, I think, well, I know, like are only available to certain people. And so to defund public schools, which provide education for everybody regardless of circumstances, to fund these personal choices, that's where I think it's a moral issue for a lot of people who are strong advocates of public education. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your thoughts about the voucher money going to religious organizations, either of you? When we talk about the public education dollars going to religious schools, Catholic or Lutheran or whatever, I know there's several right near my house that take vouchers, and that money comes, from my understanding, directly from the public education budget. And what's the line there between?
Well, I mean, I think for a lot of people that crosses the line of separation between church and state. And to me, it's a viewpoint that makes sense. Of course. And again, it's not that people don't have the option of going to a religious school. That's a choice that they have. But again, that's a choice that they make, and then they can take responsibility for funding that as opposed to taking money away from public schools to fund that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you make a really good point. I mean, it's definitely a moral issue when we weaken our public school system. And I think there needs to be a balance of how we invest into the vouchers and into the public school, not raiding one fund like we had some instances with the state budget. For many years, we would use different accounts to fund other things. So definitely avoid that. But yeah, at the same time, when it comes to religious institutions, those individuals are also taxpayers. So, I mean, to me, if we're going to be taking money from public education, that should be a balance of the proportionate taxation of the students who choose to leave that environment to go to a different environment, because ultimately that's the tax money that's being used anyways. So if they can do it somewhat proportionately, so if the child leaves and they can use those amounts and not go above and take too much money away from the public school system, I think that would make sense.
I think, to me, I feel like there's a fundamental difference in, how we're framing it at that point, just because, it makes it sound like, well, you're paying this much money in toward taxes. You should get this much money back for your individual child, which I think really kind of changes the overall goal of public education. Because, I mean, people are paying tax dollars toward education who don't have any children at all, or whose children have already gone through the school system. There's a broader purpose and a broader function to public education than just saying, I paid in this amount of tax dollars, so I should get this number of tax dollars out for my particular child. The problem is that a lot of the times the children whose parents can afford to not only take a voucher and send them to a private school, but make up the thousands of extra dollars that probably go into that tuition and have the life circumstances they can transport that child to and from school and all the things that go along with shifting to a private school education, which again, it's fine. But you are shifting those public school dollars away from a place that they're educating kids that don't necessarily have those personal circumstances and those personal advantages. So I think having a dollar to student ratio and saying, well, they're not there, that it's not the way it works in terms of public education, because those dollars are shifted out to cover students who have other challenges and have other needs. So I don't think it actually hits the system proportionally the way it sounds like it would.
So we've talked a little more about our local scene. This really goes right into what's happening nationally at the federal level. The little bit of research that I've done, it looks like Trump's education budget really favors school choice, it's favoring giving funding to states that open up their school choice. What are your thoughts on the federal government kind of pushing that onto the states and giving preference to states that offer that school choice? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I did a lot of reading at the time that Betsy DeVos was being confirmed, and that they were discussing her as education secretary in terms of what happened in Michigan with the policies that she was promoting. And there was a lack of accountability for charter schools. I mean, to the point that they actually had bipartisan support to have more accountability for charter schools, and she withheld funding from Republican lawmakers until they said they were going to vote against it. And if you look at what happened in Detroit, I mean, what happens when you are funding these private schools instead is that you're moving toward a privatization of public schools. So these private schools aren't necessarily functioning on where do these kids need the most help? Like, where do we need to go to help kids most? It's based on profit. So there's actually evidence that in Detroit, like, they had these high standards for public schools that they couldn't meet under the circumstances and the funding they had. So they're shutting down public schools in inner cities and places where they have socioeconomic challenges. And then they're replacing them with private schools, but there's actually not enough schools now in like the inner city and places where there's more socioeconomic challenges because it's more profitable to have your schools elsewhere. So when you look at that microcosm of where those policies started, to me, it's really, really concerning. And it gets to that overall push of how it's not just choice for people. It's not, it's actually like a move toward privatizing education, which is really going to lead toward, toward differing qualities of education. And kids are going to be locked into that based on the family they're born into. And it will really honestly change the shape of America in terms of us being that land of opportunity where everybody makes it based on their natural skills and their willingness to work. Like, if kids are born into a socioeconomic status and their entire quality of education is locked into that because they have to pay for it, even with government assistance, it's like you get a $7,000 voucher, but guess what? Like, the kids who are a socioeconomic status up from you aren't going to be going to like schools that cost $7,000. It's going to become stratified in terms of quality, and it's going to be very limiting for people, and it's frightening to me, honestly.
Okay. Vanya, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and to that point, I think it's a beautiful time for the 10th Amendment. I mean, powers aren't given to the federal government, should be given to the states. And it's unfortunate to see such a takeover at the federal level, whether it's funding or different regulations. I think this really should be a state issue, and clearly at the state level, it's a whole new conversation. But in general, what we have to talk about is competition. How do different systems drive each other to improve their services, whether it's open enrollment, where you see clearly an opportunity for Green Bay to compete better with Ashwaubenon, because you see the disparity there, 200 some kids coming in, over 1,000 leaving. So that's a perfect example of the federal funding that's given out to the states should, number one, be very minuscule or non-existent, because it should really be a state issue. And second, it should not be a partisan issue. We should not have these majority Republican and minority Democrats or vice versa discussions. We really have to come together on this and talk about exactly what Lindsay just mentioned. How do you break down these socioeconomic barriers where kids may not often be afforded the opportunity to pursue their education, to start their family, their business, and to break the chain, the generational chain, if you will. So yeah, my hope is that this isn't such a huge mandate, and a party of less government would actually be of less government, and let the states make these decisions with every stakeholder at the table.
It's interesting because actually one thing that Trump said last week, he signed an executive order telling the Department of Education to identify areas that the federal government has actually overstepped their bounds. And for once, I can't say I necessarily disagree with that. I do really believe in local control. My concern always is I think the federal government provides districts with guidelines for civil rights and for children with disabilities. That's where my concern comes in, is if the federal government isn't involved. Any thoughts on that? That's concerning for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are certain rights that need to be protected for all students and all children, regardless of what state they live in. Because, I mean, honestly, to me, it's not outside the realm of imagination that if they cut back federal protections for students with disabilities or, whatever marginalized population you want to look at, that there are certain states that would move to not protect that. And we need protections for people.
Yeah.
And that's something that should be national.
Yeah. That was just signed last week, the executive order was. So we actually do have a little microcosm that I think has been looked at nationally. We have Milwaukee here in Wisconsin they were one of the first districts to really utilize that school choice. So interesting. I just read a study that was done by the guy who was the vice president of the School Choice Association. And I was shocked by this. 41% of the voucher schools in Milwaukee have shut their doors from 1991.
Because they're not profitable enough. They just had another one like recently within the past week that closed 6 weeks before the school year is done.
Right.
Because they weren't making like a big enough profit margin. And then you have an entire school worth of kids that are shifting into public schools because public schools are always going to take kids with 6 weeks left. And public schools are going to be taking on all of that cost. And because the funding was already distributed for the year, the public schools are going to be getting no funding to cover that for those children. I mean, I think that gets to like that issue of education for profit, and that it's not necessarily putting kids first the way that public education does. And if I could just speak to something really quickly that came up, it's not totally unrelated. There's also a study that came out within the past month or so that was just fascinating to me. They did it based on Wisconsin because we were kind of a test ground for voucher schools. So as this is looking to go more national, and it actually showed that 2/3 of voucher money is going to families in the top 13% economically. So when this discussion comes up, So when this discussion comes up of we need to have more competition or more choice so that these students in struggling low-income schools can be more successful, like I said, there are so many barriers to kids in low-income situations to accessing these schools, even with vouchers, that the people who are primarily benefiting them are people who can already afford these choices.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. The interesting part of the study that I read, too, was that actually schools that had a religious affiliation with them were less likely to close in Milwaukee.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting, and I have to wonder, maybe is that because those were schools that were already established that took the voucher money? I have no idea. Yeah,
I don't know about that either. I would wonder though too, I think like you said, there's probably a good chance that a lot of those were established already. I know in Green Bay, we've been on the trajectory that we used to have a lot of Catholic schools here in Green Bay, and I know that number's cut down recently. But yeah, and I mean, they already had a lot of financial support from parishes and everything like that too. So I think that, already existing religious schools that already had a system of financial support outside of the voucher system probably had more stability, would be my guess.
And if I just may add to that, just overall, not your point necessarily, but just overall, I think it's been clear at the federal level and the state level that, the flexibility of voucher schools to exist is doable. And if they're going to be going down at 41% and even further, that's back to the case of, supply versus demand, and, that free market working itself out and competition, public schools will, win ultimately, if you want to put it that way. So that's, the law provides for it. So, that's in place. But when you look at, is there, even discrimination? The Obama administration had a study into the voucher schools. Department of Justice looked into it. Not a single case of discrimination. So if we're going to be truly inclusive and not selectively inclusive, we're going to talk about homeschool environments, public school environments, voucher and charter. Are some better for certain kids? Absolutely. Like I said, we want to break those socioeconomic barriers. But if we're going to be a society of inclusiveness and diversity, we can't be conditionally inclusive. We can't be conditionally diverse.
I guess I need a little more context about where you're getting at with that.
Sure.
In terms of where do you think there is the discrimination coming in?
Well, some people say that individuals, there's been concern brought up, individuals with disability may not have the same access to voucher schools, and that there might be some sort of even financial discrimination going on. And that investigation concluded that that was not going on. So sort of those backgrounds.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we really just touched on a tiny little bit of education.
I learned a lot, Lindsay. That was really good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to get into a different topic because Lindsay, when I became friends with her on Facebook, one of the reasons I did was because she had organized a march for public television because Obama, you said Obama, and
Yeah, there you go.
now I wishful thinking.
Yes.
Obama did not try to cut from
No.
PBS
Obama
kids.
So true. So true.
Trump, he proposed cutting funding to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So if either of you would like to talk a little bit about that, I know Lindsay would, and Vanya, I'd love your thoughts on federal funding
Absolutely.
for media.
I'm not like quite as brushed up on the numbers as I was when the march
no,
happened,
that's
but
okay.
if I remember correctly, it was that per person or per citizen, like PBS or public broadcasting in general costs each citizen, I think it's like $1.63 or $1.67 per year.
$1.35.
$1.35. Okay, thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So when you look at that kind of investment and then that kind of turnaround that people have, the investment versus what people get out of it, I think that's a good investment. And I think it's like a perfect example of the way that sometimes a small investment collectively can give us a really good resource that the majority of people use at some point during the year. I know there was like some criticism because like there's the whole Sesame Street is run by HBO now and blah, blah, blah. But honestly, like PBS and PBS Kids is actually the way that people have access to that without having to be able to afford an HBO subscription. So, there's still that aspect of it as well. So, I mean, to me, and again, it's not just whether or not you have kids watching PBS Kids or whether you're directly watching it yourself. It's educational, it's commercial free, and it's violence free. And I think there's like a general benefit to the community and in terms of early education that I think everybody benefits at least $1.35 per year from it. And I'd hope that we could say that $1.35 is well spent. And over half of Americans, I think it was 70%, did not support completely cutting the funding that he was proposing. So it was unpopular.
And I see it as a tie into education. As a homeschool family, we do use PBS. We've watched documentaries, and there's really been some interesting things that we've watched with my daughter on documentaries and things like that. So, Vanya, any thoughts on
Sure.
federal funding for that?
Yeah, well, even being homeschooled and being done around that 3:30, 4 o'clock range, I remember being excited to turn on Arthur or that latest show.
Yeah.
And I loved it. So, I mean, you make a great point, $1.35. The support is overwhelming for this true investment. It's not just some fun show to watch. It's an investment into education. And when we want to talk about, the budget and keeping people accountable, well, how about every congressman pitches in a little bit and keep, PBS funded by themselves? I mean, the benefits that they get, the perks that they have, and to be sacrificing children's education and their creativity for $1.35. Yeah, let's not be silly.
So would you recommend to people who have voted for Trump, who are supporters, would you recommend that they reach out to their congressman to
Absolutely.
support this?
It's an investment into kids' future.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say too, it was really fascinating reading comment sections on some of those stories because it was like really an eye-opening moment for me in terms of how politicized everything has become, and that you had people saying, well, I want my kids to be able to watch Sesame Street, and there were people like going on and saying, if you want that liberal hippie, your kids to watch that liberal hippie stuff, then you can pay for it yourself. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I grew up in a very Republican household, and I watched Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers every day, and never did it feel like my parents were making a political statement by allowing me to watch Sesame Street. So to me, I'm like, what has the world come to that having your kid watch Sesame Street has become some kind of like partisan statement? It was really horrifying.
That's amazing.
Wow. I have never thought of Big Bird as political. Oh my goodness. What did you find with that march? Was anything stand out to you with the people who were there?
My 4-year-old threw a tantrum the entire time. No, I mean, I think it was great. I had a personal connection with a lot of people because it came together very quickly. So we didn't have a ton of time to get broader support for it. But it was like a very positive environment. I think, were you there? I can't remember.
I could not make it. We had some other homeschool activities that day, so it didn't work out.
Yeah. But no, it was like a really positive environment. I think the only snafu is my kid throwing the tantrum the whole time. But very positive for a lot of kids. It was like their first time marching. It was something like they could be connected to. And I heard from a couple of friends afterwards that like, you know, they were doing bath time and their kids started chanting like, ho, ho, hey, hey, Curious George has got to stay in the middle of bath time and stuff.
So cute.
Yeah, it was. I'm like, we're going to make the cutest march ever. So that was my goal. And I think it was fun.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope it's, you know, for me, it was like really cool to get to model positive political activism for my kids, because I know I've been spending a lot of time away from home doing stuff that for them, you know, saying I'm working for fair election maps doesn't really translate to a 4-year-old very well. But it was fun to work on an issue that I know translated for them and that meant something to them, and to kind of model that for them as well.
Were there marches around the country? Do either of you know, were there marches around the country?
Not anything coordinated that I saw. I did see other ones around that same time, and there were a lot of petitions going around, but there wasn't like a day where a bunch of people were organizing at the same time.
Okay. All right. Any final thoughts from either of you? We're wrapping up already.
That
was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it went very quickly.
Yeah, I know. There's so much that we could cover on this. Yeah. 30 minutes is really not a lot. Yeah. But any final thoughts from either of you? You were both great.
Oh, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, because honestly, I think like having these chances to talk face to face about things and do it in like a civil manner where we can both share our perspectives, it's what's missing right now. You know, and I think there's a lot of divisiveness going on, and I think it's very deliberate because people are more easy to control when they are divided and when they're fighting with each other. But I think no matter who you talk to, we have so much more in common than we think we do right now. So thank you for allowing me to participate.
Absolutely. I agree.
Likewise, thanks for letting us be on this show. I learned a lot in just the 30 minutes we were here. But yeah, you're right on. It's unfortunate that education has become so partisan, and that it only aids to the division of, I think, what is the finest nation in the world, being, adopted from Russia. It says a lot. But yeah, I think really got to come back to these sort of discussions, the kitchen table, the park conversations, get off of Facebook, and let's start, making these changes as a community.
Yeah, I agree. So we just really touched on things. I can't wait for both of you to come back. Please come back.
Absolutely. This was great.
We definitely want our panelists to come back. It really was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. So that wraps up Political Radar Echo, episode 2. Thank you again for coming on. For show notes, go to politicalradarecho.com/2. If you are watching this episode on YouTube, like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications. For more great political content, don't forget to check out Political Radar Pulse, Rhonda's show. It's great. And if you'd like to support this show, you can like the show on Facebook and join the Political Radar Echo community on Facebook. Please be nice on there. And you can buy shirts and other merchandise at politicalradar.com/shop. Thanks.
Thanks for watching Political Radar Echo. To ensure that you'll never miss an episode, subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. To check out more episodes of Political Radar Echo, visit politicalradarecho.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.